Once upon a time, there was an able young composer of humble beginnings who wrote a masterpiece. Elated with what he had done, he decided to have it performed. So he went to the king in the hopes of being granted permission to do it. For the king held sway over all the musicians of the land. After listening tolerantly to the composer's plea, the king advised him that, in order to have his piece performed, he'd have to provide a set of parts for the players. And so it was that exactly 1 year later, the composer showed up at the front gate of the king's castle with all the parts neatly copied and bound. The sentry at the front gate, however, refused to admit the composer into the castle's keep, for the king, he claimed, had a busy schedule and was not to be disturbed at any cost. In spite of that, the sentry offered, albeit grudgingly, to convey the parts to the king's inner sanctum at the end of his watch. In the meantime, he scrawled the king's cell phone number on a slip of paper and handed it to the composer, advising him to call His Imperial Majesty during business hours. When the composer finally got up the nerve to telephone the king's secretary answered on behalf of her lord and relayed the message to the composer that although the king had received the parts in good order, His Royal Highness had decreed, notwithstanding, that in preparation for the opuscule in question, to qualify to be eligible for consideration of a possible performance, the musical copy would needs must comply with more rigorous standards of legibility than what was evidenced by the quote, unquote, poultry scratched boomph subministrated by the supplicant. Hence, the entire manuscript would needs must be professionally recopied using state-of-the-art music notation software instead of a mossy old quill. And so it was that exactly 2 years later, after having worked overtime at the meatpacking company, for that was his day job, in order to earn enough dimes to meet the expenses of a personal computer and all its indispensable accessories, and after having scrupulously recopied his piece during every spare moment he could muster, the composer finally telephoned the king's secretarial assistant to notify him that the score and parts were ready and that he had done everything His Majesty had requested. Secretarial assistant explained to the composer that in order for his score to qualify to be eligible for consideration of a possible future performance by musicians of the royal court, he would needs must follow the submission guidelines posted on the king's website. As it turned out, the fine print indicated that recordings of submitted works were required of all supplicants who wished to have their pieces played. So it was that exactly 5 years later, after having saved enough pennies from his day job at the meatpacking company and his night job at the sewage treatment plant, the composer, in order to meet the crowned head's stringent requirements, engaged a group of clock-punching mercenaries to record his piece, enabling it thereby to become eligible to qualify for consideration of a contingently possible future performance, wind and weather permitting, by musicians of the royal court. Some 7 months after sending the package of materials to the office of the King's Secretarial Assistant's adjutant, he received a form letter indicating that his submission could not be considered unless he provided 10 notarized letters of recommendation from his immediate overseers, written and signed on stationery bearing the King's watermark and sealed in versicles emblazoned with the King's coat of arms, wherefrom the composer inevitably drew the hitherto unforeseen inference that he would needs must, at all costs, gain admission to a nationally accredited and thus presumably reputable institution of learning, and thereon grind himself to the bone in an effort to sway his mentors to confer on him a highfalutin diploma in his field of expertise. Ergo, after 15 years of toiling as a grad student drudge, the composer, already gray, balding, and missing several of his front teeth, sent his package with the required letters of recommendation to the office of the deputy of the King's Secretarial Assistant's adjutant's maidservant. An email response was sent some 3.5 years later, informing him that a video cassette of the performance of his remitted work, plus a non-reimbursable disposal fee of $5,000, had to be included in order to enable his work to qualify to be eligible for consideration of a contingently possible future performance, wind and weather permitting and or pending available funding therefor, by understudies for musicians of the royal court. And so it was that approximately 25 years later, after having spent tens of thousands of dollars on up-to-the-second digital equipment, after having upgraded his computers and music processing software and accessories innumerable times in order to fulfill all the newest fangled notational requisites for the purpose of improving the presentability and therethrough the decipherability of his score, after having rebound and reduplicated his opuscule umpteen thousands of times to meet the perjinct specifications as per those indexed in the fine print of the downloaded PDF files from the sub-deputy of His Royal Majesty's Secretarial Assistant's Adjutant's Maidservant's Monkey's Facebook account, after having squandered his life savings on musicians, recording engineers, movie producers, graphic design consultants, acoustic technicians, psychiatrists, and all the rest, the composer finally submitted his package of materials for consideration through the instrumentality of an unscrupulously sleazy government bureaucrat whose palms he lavishly oiled, who happened to work as a part-time attendance aide at the nursing home where he, the composer, now resided. After some 6.5 additional years of watching for his moment, an itsy-witsy email message finally materialized unbeknownst to the composer, on the display terminal of the nursing home's mainframe, notifying him that, regretfully, only those supplicants meeting certain age limitations, political leanings, institutional affiliations, racial profiles, sexual deviations, and so on, who were able to provide a significant documentary evidence of, quote, high-profile performances of critically acclaimed and or culturally influential orchestral works of supersymphonic proportions having transpired within the last month in internationally distinguished metropolitan venues such as Carnegie Hall or the King's Castle, unquote, were deemed enabled at this juncture to be regarded as being eligible to qualify to eventually have their scores considered, in all likelihood, for contingently possible feature performances, wind and weather permitting, and or pending available funding, therefore, by surrogate adjuncts to understudies for inmates of the Royal Correctional Facility on the Quag. And thus our hero's piece, was no longer held to be deemed admissible for future consideration. More further, if he wanted his manuscripts, CD recordings, video cassettes, master tapes, photobiographies, expository essays on the whys and wherefores of pinning one's hopes on having one's music played and how the realization of such a figment would benefit one's career as a composer, countersigned affidavits, divorce papers, DVDs, motion picture reels, criminal records, etc., etc., forwarded to the nursing facility in which he was presently lodged. He was pre-advised to FedEx and SASE bearing the correct postage within 6 hours of e-signing for the aforesaid rejection notification, with the explicit caveat that non-compliance to the foregoing would automatically and without fail set in motion the administrative machinery by which an official authorization would be issued, autographed, and notarized forthwith, giving carte blanche to a convolution of faceless functionaries who would thenceforward gleefully take it upon themselves, as soon as they received a euphoric thumbs up from their stupid visors, to summarily incinerate all materials heretofore submitted by said supplicant for prejudication by esteemed affiliates of the Royal Underfootmen's Snub Committee. Volunteer helper at the nursing home who inadvertently stumbled upon the e-dispatch, which, in spite of having been spoken for with an e-signature, had also been recklessly mislabeled as spam, was all utterly clueless apropos of to whom or what specifically it bore reference, and thuswise availed herself of the prerogative of consigning it to the trash icon in the nethermost sinister corner of the screen. Hence, in less than a nanosecond, our hero's rejection notification was permanently expunged from the dioceses of cyberspace. so 'twas that for another 10-odd years, the composer, who by this time was a doddering, decrepit old fart with nary a tooth to his name, stoically awaited an answer from the king whilst strapped to his wheelchair, paralyzed from the neck down. One late summer's after, the composer thought, nay, swore on his mother's tomb, that he'd heard his piece aired as a toilet paper jingle on the telly in one of the dorms circumjacent to his padded 6x8. But then, on the other hand, he was uncertain whether or not he could recognize his music any longer. Perhaps he'd only imagined he'd heard it, he mulled, as he sank swiftly, heart and soul, into a slough of despond. And so 'twas that the composer spent his final days watching television in the desperate wan hopes of catching the toilet paper jingle once again. But well away, afore he'd had a chance to salute the quonundrum of how his timeless, age-encrusted Meisterwerk had fallen from such longed, glorious heights to such preface depths of consumerism, he slipped his breath early one morn with a frown of perplexity indelibly infixed upon his sinciput.